You may have heard about the art of war. You may have heard this idea, or you may have read Sun Tzu. But did you know that the Chinese war philosopher was not the only one of his kind? In fact, Napoleon Bonaparte, the first French emperor, had his own maxims, his own list of rules to follow, especially when it comes to both war and power. Now, we might say that Sun Tzu was more successful because we don't have some detailed account of his downfall. However, let's start with this. One of the more simple but prominent warnings that Napoleon gave, perhaps he should have followed, is this: the greatest danger occurs at the moment of victory. And we are seeing this play out today in the political conversation and the social conversation around the wildfires going on in California. And as a result, we've brought on a guest who has maybe a little bit of experience in the area. We'll just see what your your response is going to be. So, Tim Selbrede, you were over in Ranger Battalion, so that means I get to continue my nepotistic guest selection. Also, you've worked as a how do you call it? A wildland firefighter. You have also been on the military and law enforcement side, as well as you've worn many hats for Maxim, but now you're a free agent hopefully coming with us to SHOT Show this year. So give us an introduction.
What's going on, buddy? Like you said, my name is Tim Selbrede. I'm based out of Southern California. I'm a former medic from 2nd Ranger Battalion, the only battalion that matters. I was a firefighter for the U.S. Forest Service a couple years before I joined the Army. And then for a while after my time at 275. My entire career was on the Angeles National Forest, which is in LA County here in Southern California. I did that until I broke my femur in a non-firefighting related incident, unfortunately. But I mean, it was my life's work. I really loved working for the Forest Service. It's one of the best jobs on the face of the earth. Terrible pay, but it's really, really awesome environment to get to operate in. I worked for Maxim Defense, not anymore, but I worked for them for a while as their law enforcement sales manager. And then I did like their marketing for a while, and I do some training with some folks out in Little Rock, Arkansas, whenever I get a chance to get out there.
Cool. So we've talked about multiple things before, but today's subject is clearly hot on the heels of, it's like
fire away.
Let's make a bunch of dad puns about California burning, while I try to coif my hair as good as Newsom's. But it's a hot topic. There's definitely a lot of the white hot center of interest right now. We're done.
Now, I'm very excited to announce the first official sponsor of the Redacted Culture Cast. Obsidian Arms is one of those companies that reflects the many facets of gun culture. Not only are their firearms frequently found on competition fields like USPSA and 3-Gun, but they are a Minnesota-based, U.S.-sourced original equipment manufacturer. Obsidian Arms makes their own punch and tool kits for the amateur and professional gunsmith out of Little Canada, Minnesota, that come with a lifetime warranty. Whether it is fine parts that require a Swiss machine, or you're in the design phase and are looking for an American machine shop that is in tune with the needs of gun culture, go check out Obsidian Arms at obsidianarms.com. Thank you, and now back to the show.
So, Tim, I wanted to have this conversation with you because you and I have talked about it, and whenever there's these kind of big events, I guess I can't even say it that way. It seems like for the last, as long as I've been alive, so much of American daily life is dominated by this constant news cycle. And we talk about it oftentimes about how something will be of utmost importance and critical for you have to know what is right and true about this thing, only to it be irrelevant in like 2 weeks. And as the meme goes, anytime there's an event and a plethora of experts on the subject pop up and come out of the woodwork. So yes, 3 years ago, everyone was a Ukraine-Russia relationship conflict expert. Now everyone's a wildland firefighter expert, and tomorrow everyone's going to be whatever, right? I'm an expert on ballistics and long-range shooting.
More bridge construction and maritime operations too. That's another good one that everyone was freaking out over a while ago.
Yeah, or like, you know, oh, I'm an expert in train logistics. You're like, okay, whatever.
Yeah.
So I wanted to have you on because it was, well, I mean, I did catch a rant, but it was also good to I actually wanted to know a little bit more about what was going on, and I think that you've got something to bring to the table. So you part of your bio, part of your background is working in the field of firefighting. So what does that actually mean to the average citizen? Because when so many people think of firefighting, they might think of red hats and sirens and trucks going to a building on fire, but are we dealing with something that's not just bigger in orders of magnitude, but completely different? What are we dealing with here?
So like firefighting as a profession, as a industry, I guess you could really kind of call it that, has evolved a lot over the last 260 years in the United States. You know, we've gone obviously away from horse-drawn carriages with steam pumps and steam reservoirs with Dalmatians. You know, you see the clips from the movie Gangs in New York is actually a really funny and interesting and very accurate way of how firefighting brigades used to run back in the day. You know, we've seen an advance through the 20th and 21st century where firefighting operations have undergone a big change where they handle quite a bit of medical calls. In fact, that's the majority of what fire departments are going to be going on. When you look at their call logs, it's almost always medical calls. So firefighter paramedics, firefighter EMTs are usually the first folks to interface with the public when it comes to a lot of disasters. Fire departments tend to operate under a principle called all risk, right? So they're tasked for everything. You call 911, you're getting the fire department, right? I mean, obviously they're not going to a hostage situation, although they will be there staged safely for, you know, EMS operations in case whether the public, the suspect, or law enforcement gets injured. But firefighting is like this much of what they do nowadays, unfortunately, right? Well, actually, that's not unfortunate because obviously fires are catastrophic, and every firefighter loves to fight fire. It's like the favorite thing in the world. Like, you want to see everybody get off the blue couch real fast. When the bell goes off and it's a fire call, everyone gets in the truck very fast. It's a huge it's probably the closest adrenaline rush you can really get to that is like combat in certain areas. Not necessarily coupled with the terror that comes with combat, but firefighting can be quite scary if you find yourself in a pickle. I have a very limited experience in municipal firefighting. I work for Gig Harbor Fire and Medic 1, which is fire department up in Gig Harbor, Washington, for about 6 to 7 months as a resident firefighter, which is basically like a live-in permanent volunteer, waiting to go to the academy and get hired on as full-time staff. I went to 4 fires in 6 months, and everything else was toothache calls, Band-Aid runs at 3 a.m., going to the old folks' home, suicides. You know, you go to everything. Working for the U.S. Forest Service, which is a federal agency, is where I've spent the vast majority of my time. And in that time, I've worn a few different hats there. I've been on engine modules, so like Type 3 fire engines, the big green trucks that everybody sees rolling around, especially in the western part of the United States. I spent a couple years in a couple different hotshot crews, which are Type 1 crews, hand crews. I was not a smoke jumper. It's a total different animal. And yeah, it was the second best job I ever had in my entire life outside of being a medic in battalion.
Okay, so I wanted to start with that quote by Napoleon, particularly because the firefighters that are taking place in California right now have become such a political topic.
Sure.
Of course, Donald Trump is saying that Newsom needs to resign, and you could go anywhere. You can't go anywhere without somebody turning it into a political subject.
Sure.
And I wanted to begin with the warning because it like from what it sounds like, you have people making political hay, so to speak, out of this situation. But as much as they think that they might be making a victory, they are putting themselves out at great risk. I could think of a couple of examples of whether it's blaming Gavin Newsom or the city or the mayor or California's politics or the smelt fish thing. So can you regarding the fire in California, is there like, do you have like a classification system? Is this something that you describe? You would say, oh no, we go back to this. It's a classic type 3 fire that is most likely caused by X event. And then can you give us like a better example? Because I mean, you're out of California too, so you should know a thing or two.
Sure. There's kind of a lot to touch on there. I'll try to minimize any of my personal political opinions on this. I think Gavin Newsom needs to go anyway, and this is the least of his worries why he needs to go. He should have been gone a long time ago.
Okay.
With that said, it isn't Gavin Newsom's creation for this. It isn't Karen Bass, the current mayor of Los Angeles. It's not her fault either. Everyone's freaking out over the cut of the $17 million from the budget. Most of that was from overtime, not fire apparatuses and preventative fire maintenance. Like, no, a lot of that money was cut from overtime allotments. But I also don't pretend to be a budgeteer. Gavin Newsom is not the first governor, regardless of his political party, to run the public lands poorly. Jerry Brown was before him. He was completely worthless and inept. Before that, it was, I think, Schwarzenegger, who was, a Republican in name only. And then before that, it was Gray Davis, who was a Democrat, who he lost his job during the Enron fallout when California was experiencing severe rolling blackouts, which is funny because Gavin Newsom's blackouts have been way worse than Gray Davis's ever were. So like that's kind of like the end of my political, like where I'm trying to place blame on any one specific person. The truth is, it's a very complex issue with some areas that should be pretty easy to understand that aren't. When to kind of bring it to the maxim that you brought up from Napoleon, people on the right now are doing just victory lap after victory lap, especially after the election, rightfully so, I think, because, there's hope restored to a lot of them, but also a lot of arrogance and ego, where you've got these people that are wanting to dunk on Gavin Newsom, which go for it. I mean, the guy's a turd, but they sound stupid too. Like their arguments are completely, they're just talking out their ass. It's a very complex thing to talk about how we fix the problems in California, but one of the biggest ways that this needs to be fixed is the public land management, specifically with the fuel loads that are on there. Fuel meaning vegetation in this instance.
Okay, so let's tear this back a little bit. You said you said it's a complex situation. I'm assuming we're talking about the current fires in California, like how they started and what were the. I'm trying to be
sure
specific here. When you're talking about it's a complex conversation or it's a complex subject, you're not just talking about the currently burning fire, but all of the factors that have contributed to the scale and devastation that it has produced. Or are you talking about the political and socioeconomic, whatever you want to call it, the political and structural issues with California as a whole? I think I'm trying to be more specific here.
Well, I can answer your questions one way. Yes.
Okay.
It's all of the above. To go low-hanging fruit real quick, the complexities of this incident is very complex. So when we have a disaster response, they are typically brought into incident command types through NIMS. So you're like a type 5, type 4 is a very easy, like vehicle fire, dumpster fire, maybe even a small spot fire away from the main body of a bigger fire. That's a small incident. It's an incident within an incident. And then you can, of course, start stacking complexities on there when you start adding wildland urban interface, which is really bad out here as far as a challenge to get under control. And then, when you start adding in so many different agencies that go to these responses, that is a very difficult task to manage. And so this is what's called a type 1 incident. They're getting away from using like incident command teams and they're turning them to CMITs, which I was recently alerted to. critical management incident. I don't know. I can't tell you what CMINT is. I just learned about it yesterday. But basically, as you increase the complexity of an incident and you turn it into like a type 2, a type 1, you're going to get a bunch of things just kind of right out of the box. You're getting certain types of qualified incident commanders, division commanders, branch commanders, or branch supervisors, logistics, finance, supply. I mean, it's a big, it's actually very close to like a military operation, to be honest with you, as far as its organization. And then the incident command system itself is it can be kind of a brain melter for people getting into firefighting in the beginning, but honestly, it's a really great system to manage. So that's
what determines a class 1 versus a class 5? Because it's, from what I've picked up, the lower the number, it's like golf. The lower the number, the higher the problem.
There's a couple contribute to it. The general complexity of the fire is going to be or the incident is going to be the big one, right? Like, and it doesn't have to be a disaster. You can use the incident command system to manage parades, public events, the Super Bowl. They actually use the incident command system for like the Super Bowl management. But you know, if you have a fire that's 100 acres in the middle of absolutely nowhere and you've got 2 fire engines on it and it's just kind of punking around, that's not a very complex incident. But if you have those same 100 acres in Pasadena, it's a very complicated incident very fast, because you have a lot of public, you have law enforcement response, you have obviously multiple agencies are going to respond. And again, I'm using a very specific location for this kind of an example. Pasadena is off the 210 freeway and north of the city of Los Angeles in LA County, but it sits on the front country of the Angeles National Forest. So the Angeles National Forest and local agencies between LA County, LA City, Pasadena, you know, Arcadia, all these guys, we have what's called mutual aid agreements. And so you're always going to get federal response to fires depending on where that fire is on a map. The Angeles National Forest is cut kind of into 3 parts by the I-5 that runs north-south, and then the 14 freeway that runs from Santa Clarita to the Antelope Valley. Everything on the Grapevine, the I-5 corridor, that's on both sides of the freeway, that's federal land. It's federally administered land, congressional boundaries and all that. You go into the 14 corridor, that's all county land, but that's a mutual aid zone. So if there's a fire that's not near the congressional boundaries of the U.S. Forest Service's land, Forest Service is still going to send a response. We can skip over like how long that's a free ride and when does the agency start charging other agencies, but the complexity of multiple fires in a very small, relatively small area, often, but not always, sometimes they turn those into what's called a complex. And for your viewers, I've also been gone from the agency for almost 9 years now. So the things have changed. And so I might not be with all the accurate information all at once, but sometimes they'll take those multiple fires and they'll turn it into a complex. And so they have a giant unified command with that kind of stuff. I don't know if they've done that yet with these. I haven't heard that they have, but yeah. So every one of these fires has its own incident command staff, and they're being ran independently. The last thing that you mentioned that I wanted to touch on is the cause of these fires. That's kind of a loaded question. No fault of your own, but it's okay. Because people want to know what started these. Is it arson? Is it what? Incompetence isn't necessarily a cause of the incident, but it certainly adds to it. All these things kind of add up and boil over. And we call, in the Forest Service, we have a lot of maxims and idioms too. One of the things that we like to talk about is the Swiss cheese model, right? So you have a piece of cheese which has got a hole in it, you line it up with another piece of cheese with a hole in it, and then eventually you can, pass all the way through the block of cheese because you've just put in all these mistakes in place, right? The Forest Service is responsible for federal land management, not the Hollywood Hills. That is not federal land. That falls into the city of Los Angeles, the county of Los Angeles, just the general state. To try to quickly shut up and oversimplify this, the biggest issue that the West in general experiences is just the fact that we haven't been able to do prescribed fires the way we want to. And we've also gotten too good at putting fires out too quick.
So what's a prescribed fire that you're talking about?
So
like you said the 2 issues that Western America is dealing with is we're too good at putting fires out, and we have not been able to implement prescribed fires. So this sounds like I'm trying to like because as I'm listening, my brain is like putting things together, and I'm sitting here going, okay, so I presented a question of like, oh, who's at fault here? And you go, no, it's not really a question of fault. Like you can say, Steve lit it's not what's the traumatic movie that we watched when we were kids? Black Beauty with the horse.
Oh,
it's like, oh, you know, they like the guy smokes a cigarette and he throws it on the ground and it burns down the barn kind of thing.
Yeah.
It's not that we're not dealing with that kind of that kind of well, it's obviously the bad guy's fault kind of thing. We're dealing with a series of mismanagements or a long list, maybe a long chain of things that slipped through that should have been done that weren't done, that compounded into creating the circumstance by which a fire like this could break out. That's what I understand it as. So it's not like, oh yeah, it's Gavin Newsom's fault per se that he deliberately like inspired the fire, so to speak.
Yeah,
but it's more
Santa Ana winds.
He didn't create the. He created the winds. Sounds like a book. But rather the issue is, okay. So I'm going back to what we're talking about. I'm trying to keep myself straight. Is the so the it's not so much we're talking about a specific person's fault as if they were guilty of creating the fire, but there are multiple things that could have been done, that should have been done, that would have mitigated and limited the scale and possibility of this. And one of them that you recommended or you talked about was prescribed fires, which I'm assuming is sort of like preemptive burning of the underbrush or something like that. And the other one is we've gotten too good at putting fires out. So what do both of those mean to someone who, like myself, who thinks I know what you're talking about, but I might be very wrong?
Before I get to those two questions and statements, I want to backtrack for the comment section loses their marbles. There is somebody at fault for some of these fires, right? The one that was just started in Woodland Hills is believed to be arson, and they have him in custody.
Okay.
So that might be an actually intended, what we call a hot start, an actual intentional fire. So 90% of all fires start by lightning, but in California, 90% of all fires start off the side of the road. It's not so simple as someone flicking a cigarette out the window. You can start a fire that way. It's a little bit more difficult than people are aware of. You have to have a lot of really good conditions for that receptive fuel bed to catch fire. You know, it's got to be a certain temperature outside, certain relative humidity. The fuel moisture itself has to be ready to burn. You have this thing called surface to mass ratio, where if I take a blowtorch and I put it on a tree, it's not going to light the tree on fire. But if I take a blowtorch and just dab it on some grass, the grass is going to go, right? It's the way that specific fuel can or can't absorb heat. Wood is a poor conductor of heat, so that's one of the reasons why it incinerates. Now, there's also possible fault at blame that needs to be investigated, and it's going to be investigated. Whether or not anything happens of it is beyond me. Where sometimes these fires are started by power lines sparking and failing. People don't appreciate, like, some of these telephone poles can snap absolutely in half in these winds, and now you have live wires that are now in the ground, which is likely what I believe caused Lahaina, not energy weapons, in Hawaii. You know, that was another, pardon the expression, perfect storm. So there's going to be potential negligence, right, that is involved in some of these fires getting to where they're at, in the sense of if they know the Santa Ana winds are coming. This is not a new thing for us. It's from like September to February is the window for these things. In 2017, the biggest fire at the time in California history was the Thomas Fire, and that burned in December. And that was all in like the Ventura County area. And that killed my best friend, Corey Iverson, one of the best hotshots I ever worked with in my entire life. Is the only fatality in that fire, thank God. And, you know, I don't think people have any appreciation of just the insane power that fires have. Now, to talk about what's going on now, if these winds weren't present, would these fires have gotten to the severity that they're at? Absolutely not likely. Can't say for sure, obviously, but very unlikely that these fires would have gotten anywhere near the magnitude that they are had it not been for the winds. When we're trying to understand what fire may or may not do, we're considering a couple of factors. And the big triangle, the fire behavior triangle, is made up of topography influence, fuel influence, and then weather. And then the weather being the most dynamic, and to break that down, the wind being the most dynamic of those elements, right? Generally speaking, topography remains consistent. You know, fire burns uphill like water likes to go downhill. So fires sometimes will often take the path of least resistance. So you have fires that gut through drainages and valleys and box canyons and saddles. If you have fuel that's like grass and lighter fuels like the chamise and the chaparral that California is really known for, that Mediterranean climate, those fires get very, very intense very fast, versus typical fires in like heavy timber. If you're lucky, they aren't crowning through the very tops of the trees and slicking off entire mountain ranges. Those can be impossible to contain for a while. So to kind of talk about what's going on with these fires, before I jump into the prescribed fire question, there's little you can do when this is going on. Like, I don't think people get it. You know, oh, why aren't they flying helicopters at night? Well, first of all, it's at night. Second of all, those are 80-mile-an-hour winds.
Yes.
Right? Even if you could fly, you're going to drop, you know, from the belly tank, and it's going to just piss into the wind.
Okay. Yeah, these are things that these are kind of the questions I want to dig into, is
Sure.
Especially getting into the details here. Like I appreciate you being able to go specific into what's going on, because I'm from the Midwest, although I live in Arizona right now, and so much of what I'm observing is completely foreign to me. And I don't, you know what I mean? Like,
firefighters have no idea what they're walking into because they don't do wildland fire.
Well, and I'm getting, so like, as I've caught the public conversation on this over the last, I don't know, couple days, I don't think I'm alone or unique in that situation. And it like, it's really odd. I'm trying to find metaphors to describe this, but one of them is, so much of the conversations that I've seen, whether it's on public, like traditional media, social media, whatever the chit chat method is, comes across kind of like CNN reporting on war. It's like, well, no, you're or you know, like, yeah, it's this, it's like it's theater, and it's not only is it theater, but it's kind of like, well,
you get every news anchor throws their yellow Nomex shirt on, and they like to wear a mask, and they're nowhere near the fire, and they look really silly. And often, sometimes those guys put themselves at extreme risk and almost get themselves killed. We've had a few incidences where the press has tried to get in for the great shot while we're actually doing the very dynamic fire, and we've had to throw them in fire trucks to get the hell out of Dodge.
So I'll use an example of like one of the most egregious characters on the subject of conflict would be like Malcolm Nance, right? We all know, many of us know who Malcolm Nance is.
Like a Nancy boy.
And he's hilarious, and he's kind of like
an example of Dunning-Kruger.
Yeah, well, like I think Malcolm Nance is a really good not dowsing rod, but separating tool from the wheat from the chaff. Like, if you're inspired by Malcolm Nance and you think that he's doing a great job, you clearly have no idea what you're talking about. It'd be like Bill Nye, the science guy, is another really good example. Like,
I don't even get me started on him.
You know, he's not a scientist. He doesn't know anything about what he's talking about.
He's got a bachelor's degree, and he's a comedian and an actor.
Yeah, he's an actor, right? So like, this is if you want to go even another layer deeper, it's like Plato's cave. If you're familiar with that argument of, it's like Malcolm Nance is the shadow stick guy, and so if people are convinced by the shadow stick guy, then they don't understand that he's just a cartoon character. He's possibly a created, or who's the other one? But my point is, on the fire, I'm getting this perspective. I'm not saying that everyone having a conversation on the subject is a dunce on the subject. It's kind of like, well, I just don't know. What is, like, when you're talking about fuel, you're bringing up specific elements. So how do you said topography, fuel, and
weather.
weather. So topography, what are the influences that topography have on a fire? You said fire likes to go uphill. What other things are we looking at as an influence of a fire like this?
Well, so obviously like heat rises, right? So if we have a
Mhm.
fire on the slope of a mountain, it's going to go way faster uphill than you can possibly go, right? And run away from it.
What
Fire,
can you explain again? This is like I'm from flatland where a forest is flat, not
yeah.
myself, but the trees are all in a line. So a forest fire moves like this, and you're talking about them going uphill faster than you can move. Like, do you just skirt? Do you go? What's the solution then? If it,
Anchor, you flank it and you pinch it off.
oh,
That's
okay.
a very, very simplified way of saying it. But what topography can do to a fire is obviously going to be something that you have to pre-plan for, be aware of. Most mountain ranges in the Western Hemisphere, in the Northern Hemisphere, if not the world, actually run north and south. But in Southern California, we have the San Gabriel mountain range. It runs basically from northern San Diego to Santa Barbara, Lompoc area, and those mountain ranges run east to west. And with that, you have the south-facing slope of the fire that is getting beat on by the sun for longer periods of time. The dawn, peak of the day, and the sunrise, versus the north side of those mountain ranges, which are going to get less direct sunlight. They're going to have higher relative humidities over there on the north side. The fuel moisture levels are going to be higher on the north side versus the southern side of fires or these mountain ranges. You're going to have a lot more light, flashy fuels, meaning like if the fuel themselves are like grass and smaller shrub, brush, and different like things like that, and they burn like this. When we talk about fuel, the actual fuel itself, not all vegetation is created by God equally here. What people don't want to talk about, or at least they don't want to accept in Southern California, this type of stuff is supposed to happen. These fuel models that we have, these fuel types, they're supposed to burn X amount of years. The problem with allowing that to happen, especially in Southern California, is we have to protect the water. If you get so much of those hillsides slick off, right, and then you get the wind or the rains later in the season, you get mudslides and all that stuff goes in and it overwhelms like the reservoirs and the drainages and the systems and the cisterns. And so we can't exactly let wildland fire just do what it needs to do in California very easily. Versus if we're in, like, let's say the Modoc National Forest in Northern California, there's not a lot of people out there to begin with. So there's not a lot of public influence on fire suppression efforts, which is a thing that happens often. Those fires, sometimes they're better left to just kind of do their thing. We talked about fighting fire too good for too long and removing fire, the natural vacuum cleaner, from the ecosystem. In 1910, I believe, there was an incident called the Big Burn, which took place in Idaho, Montana, and eastern Washington, and it burned millions of acres of timber in a very short period of time, like days. It was an insane firestorm. It killed a lot of people, and it was basically the beginning of the birth of the U.S. Forest Service. The U.S. Forest Service falls under the USDA for some reason, instead of the Department of the Interior. I don't know why. Don't ask me. So the response to those fires was what's called the 10 a.m. policy. And that was that all fires within reason need to be controlled by 10 a.m. the next operational day. And we waged what was called the moral equivalence of war against fire. And we ended up removing fire from its natural, position in the ecosystem, where you're not supposed to have fires that are in timber, at least, completely slick everything off and moonscape it. A lot of these trees, like oak trees, sequoias, redwoods, ponderosa pine, they're pretty well fire resistant. In fact, as you cut trees in half and you look at their rings, you can sometimes see throughout the tree's life where it had fires, burning on it, and where it had really wet winters when you have big fat rings in the trees, and sometimes you have really skinny rings. Those are drought seasons. When you don't allow fire to just kind of punk around and clean up the dead and down, get rid of the duff, which is stuff is like a mixture of pine needles and dirt and all the dead, decaying organic matter. If you don't put the little fires out, they start to become bigger, and they become bigger, and they become bigger. And at some point, they ladder up through small brush, bigger brush, bigger brush, to the bottom of a tree, through the top of the tree, and to the rest of the trees. If a tree ends up losing a certain percentage of its needles or leaves, it can't survive. It can't regrow. It obviously needs those for photosynthesis. There are trees that are extremely fire resistant, like the California oaks. You might see like a big oak grove just gone and just skeletons of the tree. Give it a couple of years, they'll come back with a vengeance. And a lot of this stuff that's burning right now that everyone's just like freaking out over, it's gonna look like nothing happened in only 5 years, 6 years. That's not to say it's not tragic, and these people losing their homes that is unprecedented. The amount of destruction in the Palisades right now is unprecedented, and I hate that term. But the prescribed fire question, it's also not so simple of just waving around a drip torch, with the hotshot crews and lighting fires and letting it do its thing, because sometimes you can't do that. There's too much vegetation now because we didn't do anything about it for so long that if we want to go put fire on the ground, it's very difficult. And prescribed fires aren't just you slicking off a contour line and letting it chew to the ridge top. Sometimes if we can't control those fires and keep them low grade, which they tend to do those in the winter time for what it's worth, we'll do like what's called RXB4 fires, which is essentially we take a bunch of hot shots and a bunch of chainsaws, and everyone just turns everything into coleslaw, and we start piling them up, and you got piles all over the place, and you let them dry out, and let them, the fuel itself needs to cure so it can burn more readily. And then we just spend a couple days sipping coffee with big ass bonfires all over the place. But those are, we're pissing in the wind when it comes to the sheer size of these public lands that need to be managed. So that's just the prescribed fire side of this stuff.
All right, because it's you're building a model in my head, whether you want it to or not, and that is, and that it there's a problem. Let me put it this way: the way that you're describing it gives me the impression of if you prevent prevent any sort of foliage burn, you're talking about all these low level fires. If you prevent enough of these low level fires over time, eventually you get to a point where you can't do them.
That's 100% right.
Okay, so you can't, and you can't stop. You can't do anything preventative, and you can't stop it if it happens. Is that right?
Makes fire suppression efforts exceedingly difficult, and we see that big in California, and everyone wants to rush to blame climate change. And for climate change is not real, but it's not this thing that is this hot button marketing term that everyone's been using so they can steal money from the oil barons and move it into wind farms.
Yeah, well, I think we can safely say that climate change comes in two forms. Either it's a cult-like religion, possibly a suicide cult, on the one hand, and then the other one is something more like science. And it's very comical. I find it absolutely hilarious that the climate change people are the same people who will probably condemn something like faith and religion, even though they're clearly in this sort of religious
scientism.
Right. It's like the same people who accuse the the Catholic Church of the Spanish Inquisition, as if everyone who's Catholic is somehow responsible for the Spanish Inquisition, while meanwhile, and in the same breath, they'll also argue for like gulags and the
re-education camps, and
you know what I mean, or like re-education camps, and what's the other one? Creates reporting systems so you can like out your neighbor as not being one of the people. It's hilarious. Like, okay, the Gestapo. So, oops. My point. I'm sorry, that was a bad derailment. So let me rephrase the problem that I'm seeing in my head is that. So you take an area. We've got a mountain in our backyard.
Mm-hmm.
You take that area and it has natural forests on it. You so effectively suppress any possibility of a fire going on in any way, shape, or form for enough years. Eventually you have so much buildup of the forest floor that you can't safely start a small fire to burn up some of that fuel. but you also, in the event that that it does catch on fire, it becomes unmanageable and uncontrollable quickly. So this is a problem of like, well, then what's the solution? I don't. It sounds like kind of like a. I'm trying to figure out. I keep going to Civil War references. Is like if you prevent any sort of low-level conflict between people for enough time, then eventually it just turns into mass violence,
100%.
which is a bit of a.
No, you're not wrong from this parallel. I get it. And to the question of what do we do, I keep kind of saying, I've been saying this for a while, is like, in order for us to course correct, which is, depending on who you ask, an impossibility now that this is going to be how it is forever. I don't want to be such a defeatist with that. And again, I am not an ologist. Okay. I never worked in a fire use module. I never spent any time at the district and supervisor's office, like spending time with the flower counters to understand this stuff at a deeper level like they have. They also have the disconnect in the Forest Service is also where, you know, you have the bean counters and the flower pickers that like are disconnected from the hot shots and the firefighters. They don't know how to relate to one another's jobs. Not always, but sometimes. And that can be a bit of a contentious issue later on in the, you know, at work. But no, I've been kind of saying that in order for us to course correct, we need to wage the same amount of warfare that we did in Iraq and Afghanistan for 20 years with the same amount of money, same amount of manpower. We talk about wanting to put fire on the ground, right? Putting fire on the ground for prescribed fires is a very easy way to do this if you're not thinking about it. You might have to put people in there with shovels and rakes, like Donald Trump said, and chainsaws and animals, pack animal crews, and which is less likely needed to be used anymore because of the technology that exists in the timber industry. They can get in some pretty squirrely spots with their vehicles, but there's a lot of federally designated wilderness, and that is not all Obama's fault, but Obama made a lot of dirt federally protected wilderness, which means you can't put bulldozers in there, you can't put internal combustions and engines in there, and you can't put Phos-Chek, which is the fire retardant, which is, we put Phos-Chek in there. You got to do a lot of pre-attack work, right? So you got to do, people on the Angeles don't want to see the hills above them looking like termite mounds or termite tracks of like bulldozers blowing up, opening up ridge lines. They used to do that. In fact, they used to put Agent Orange on a lot of those dozer lines, and it got a lot of men sick back in the 60s and 70s. But those dozer operators would spend a lot of time just blowing open ridge lines. In case there was a fire, it would check itself, hopefully at that fire break. They got away from that for a while. There are some areas that the Forest Service still maintains as far as like pre-attack fuel breaks, but it's not as that isn't even its own solution. Again, you're going to have to, it's going to take decades of year-round effort and manpower to get this stuff fixed.
All right, so we're gonna go back to the war analogy.
Sure.
One of the issues with the global war on terror that you and I have experience in is that those inside the arena have a very different perspective than those outside the arena.
And this is definitely a case of that.
That makes sense. Okay, so those inside the arena, those who are, it's not just experience, but also, so I think some of it just has to do with being there. I'm trying to be a little bit superimposed. So the issue then is that what you and I saw in battalion, and was it's been, how do you call it? Testimony after testimony after testimony goes on to say that we didn't really have an objective in war, or the global war on terror. If there was a clear and present objective, it wasn't properly or effectively communicated to neither the people fighting in the war nor the people observing the war. I know I'm trying to be kind of crazy. So my point on that is, it feels like, and it's frustrating that 10 years after being in the military, I'm still reading accounts of why we were there, what we did, what our objectives were, and there still isn't any sort of universal argument like defeat the Axis, that was World War II, or prevent prevent Vietnam from becoming a communist country in the Cold War, or or eliminate a threat. It was just sort of, yeah, we had these. It was sort of like we had these kind of white paper bureaucratic goals, but they didn't correlate very well to reality. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. And so I want to compare this to how you're describing the wildfires in the way that the United States Forest Service, federal and state level organizations are oriented, constructed, and directed to prevent disasters that can be prevented. And you're saying that the overhaul is so grand that it's going to cost the same amount as it's going to require the same amount of energy, effort, and willpower that we supposedly put into the global war on terror. But if we go if we look at the global war on terror, we didn't put willpower in. I don't know how to. I'm frustrated by how I'm saying this. You and I, the ground level soldier, put willpower into the global war on terror to fix problems that the bureaucracy couldn't comprehend. And as a result, we got put away and we got put on the shelf and we got labeled and discriminated against in the United States, so that when we got back to our lives in this country, the argument was made that we're broken, we've got PTSD, we're all fucked up, and pardon my language. But the reality is we went over there, we saw the issues, we solved problems where we could. This whole hearts and minds garbage that came out of some sort of white paper room in a different country was a complete waste of human effort, because the men on the ground were the ones who could determine, no, that woman's not a threat, she's got a baby. No, that 17-year-old boy with an AK is not a threat because he's in a compromised situation, but we're going to be able to solve it this way. Find, fix, and eliminate, reduce the threat. The people on the ground solved the problems. Somebody else took the credit for it, got $1 million contract, and then ran off with whatever. And so in the solution that we're dealing with here, sorry for you kind of woke this beast up in me.
I can talk about this for hours. I get it.
so the problem that we're talking about in this issue of wildland firefighting, or just fire management as a whole, if you're going to tell me that we need to put all of this effort, energy, finance, and overhauling system, like kill the dragon. Tell me what you're talking about in that sense. I'm not angry at you. Sorry. Yeah. But like, what does that look like? What does that mean? Whose heads need to roll? What would that even do in a world where we have become so complacent in our day and age with this idea that something so big needs to be done that it'll never be done? Sure. That's not, I'm not defeatist about it.
So to some of the finer points of how to do this is, in California, we need to let the timber industry get back to doing what they do. Over the course of the last couple of decades, the timber industry has been really neutered in the West. Not just California, Oregon, and Idaho, and Washington struggle with it to different degrees, of course. And understand that even though the Forest Service is a federal agency, right, and it has bodies everywhere, the Forest Service is broken down by regions. So California is Region 5, California, Hawaii is Region 5. I think it's Region 6 is I might be wrong here. I think Region 6 is Oregon and Washington. Montana, Idaho is, and Wyoming is its own thing. Arizona, New Mexico. I think Utah and Colorado are their own. And so they're ran very closely together, but there are some differences in those regions and how they operate. California operates under what's called all risk, right? So you have wildland fire engines with, SCBA breathing apparatuses in the truck. So if these guys have to go fight fire and put water on a vehicle fire, they're not breathing in the vehicle smoke. That's very, very, very toxic and very hazardous smoke, versus like grass. It's not as bad. But the priorities of the Forest Service, like any fire department, are life, property, and then the environment, right? Like we want to protect life first. We want to do what we can to protect property, and then at the end of the day, they're just bushes and they'll come back. And so we don't want to risk a lot to not save a lot, risk a little to save a little, right? We need to allow the timber industry to go back in there, start harvesting trees. That's one of the reasons why the U.S. Forest Service falls in the USDA, is because at some point they were looking at trees as a crop, right? And I'm not saying that's the wrong call. It's not my call. But then I don't think changing the Forest Service management to the Department of Interior would change a whole lot at the end of the day. It costs a lot of money to change all the stickers on the side of the trucks, I'll tell you that. But just ask CAL FIRE, which used to be CDF, and they spent so many millions of dollars changing their uniforms and the stickers on their trucks. California has almost 21 million acres of U.S. Forest Service administered land. Gavin Newsom, in the 2019 firestorms that they were dealing with, made a pledge to treat 1 million acres a year. He didn't do any of that. So there's onus and blame on him for that, right? So I know everyone wants to blame somebody for this, and we'll get there. But we have to, the California Conservation Corps is an organization that's been around for probably 100 years by now, if not longer. It was, I think it had its heyday during the post-Depression, during the Depression era. It put a lot of men to work going and building the trails that people walk along. A lot of those trails were built by the CCCs a long time ago. Now, the CCCs as an organization right now is a skeleton of what it used to be. It's mostly full of folks that are at risk for falling through the cracks of society. I'll say it that way. They're not always like Rhodes Scholars that work there. And that's not to take anything away from the efforts that those kids put in. I say kids because they're typically in their late teens to early 20s that work for the CCCs. A lot of times you just see the CCCs rolling fire hose for you at fire camp and doing all the gopher work that firefighters don't want to be tasked with because we're busy trying to eat and rest in between shifts, you know, when we're fighting these big wildland incidences. The CCCs need to be great again, right? You need to employ tens of thousands of Californians and put them into the forests with rakes, with chainsaws. You can put goats in there, believe it or not. Yeah, goats. You can release a lot of livestock into these, and they do. And we actually use goats as a prescription for land management. Even if Gavin Newsom kept his word and did the 1 million acres of treatment a year, it wouldn't have done. It can't prevent everything. What's going on specifically in Southern California right now is that Swiss cheese model of a lot of bad things lining up all at once. It's not just that the winds from the Santa Anas are very strong. Not every Santa Ana wind event is going to have 80, 90 mile an hour winds. Sometimes they're just 30 to 40 mile an hour winds and they just throw your trash cans all over the place. But the thing with the Santa Ana winds is they come from the Great Basin. So it's a high pressure system that develops over like northern Utah, Nevada, and western Utah, Nevada, northern Arizona. That high pressure system ends up pushing the pressure gradient towards the ocean. And so we're getting these winds coming out of the northeast, which is not typical out here. And it's not just that they're very intense winds. They're also very dry and very warm given their season. Relative humidity, which is a measurement of the amount of moisture that's in a given landmass. You know, everyone talks about their humidity. It's 80. What that is telling you is that the saturation of that air sample is at X% humidity at any given moment. Fire responds quite rapidly to changes in humidity, depending on the fuel model. If you get RHs in the teens, which are very typical when fighting fire in California in the summertime,
RH being relative humidity.
Yeah, it starts to cook, and then of course you get the dry bulb, which is your temperature. Anywhere, you know, if it's in the 90s to the hundreds and like that, fire with teens and wind, it's a gasoline storm, man. Again, the fire is burning offshore, so it's burning towards the ocean. It's one of the reasons why you see so much just devastation in those communities. But the Santa Ana winds will subside. They always subside. They're usually only a couple days long, but they can do an incredible amount of damage in that time, as we've seen here. This isn't the first time an entire neighborhood in Los Angeles has been slicked off. And I think it was a 2007 Sayre fire, which was in Silmar, California, which is in the northernmost limits of the city limits of Los Angeles, the San Fernando Valley. That fire started, I believe, as a failure, an electrical failure at a municipal power box. It burned uphill and then it hooked and it picked up the wind. And everyone that I've ever talked to that fought that fire said they've never seen fire go downhill that fast. It went from the top of the slope down to the bottom, and it just nuked off an entire neighborhood in Pacoima in Silmar, burned all the way to the 210 freeway. The amount of devastation that's in these cities right now is incredible. And I definitely want to talk about the whole the fire hydrants. I want to get into that, because we talk about what happens in an actual fire, like what's going on. And this is the thing that people don't understand until, like you've alluded to, you're physically standing in the fire's beaten zone and seeing what it actually does. But to wrap it up real fast and get it back to you for a second, the amount of work that would be required for us to get these forests in public lands to the healthy levels that they should be is, I can understand why people say we're at a point of no return. It's going to be extraordinarily difficult, and we don't tend to have the willpower for that. We want to just blame somebody on it, but you also have organizations that work against the Forest Service and work against these land management agencies, like the Sierra Club, for one. Everyone sits there and wants to, like, oh, look, the granola eaters are protecting parts of Mammoth Mountain. Well, yeah, well, now Mammoth Mountain is just decadent and full of like brush that's just going to slick off, and now you're going to have a moonscape rock.
A moonscape rock. Okay, so before we get into the next part, which is going to be looking at the nuances, like looking at not the nuances, but let's call it debunking myths.
Sure.
Because I want to go back to what's the consequence here, and that sounds so pretentious. You can just yell at me now.
There could be found to be criminal negligence if the LA Department of Water and Power was told to turn off their power lines and they didn't, and those are the cause of these fires, which is a very good chance they are in trouble.
Sure. So if someone is morally responsible for the consequence, like we're going to use an example out here. We're at if a person goes out and starts a fire through negligence, right? Where I live, there are times there's public land where you can go shoot, and if you go shoot at a certain season when you're told not to and you're not supposed to, you can create a fire through either a ricochet or something stupid. If I go and I take fireworks for celebration and I go out into the desert and during the heat of the summer when it's dry and hot and bad, and I go light them off in the middle of nowhere and it creates a fire, I'm morally responsible for that. Fine. The question that I have for you is this. You're describing a scenario that correlates to reality. You are describing a real thing, a real issue in California, and you're creating an impetus, a moral impetus that something needs to change in not only the organization of it, but also you're saying that there is actually a solution to the problem, and that solution is hiring people to essentially manually remove some of the fuel from these situations. It is to deny certain organizations what they want and say, no, you may want to quote unquote protect the land, but you're not protecting, you're actually destroying it, so on and so forth. What is the consequence?
Road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Yes. So if we, let's say, if we quote unquote do nothing.
Sure.
Let's take on the language of the liberal when it comes to gun control. If we do nothing, what will the consequence be? If we continue down the course of action that we are on, which is mismanagement, human error, blah, 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 whatever you want to call it, what will the consequence be? Because what will it mean to me? Will people just have to accept that you're going to lose your house every 6 years to a massive fire? What are you talking about?
So there's a lot of consequences with this. The one we're seeing right now is the insurance companies bailing on the people that have policies or just not insuring them whatsoever.
Sure.
And it's not to sit there and talk all the crap in the world about insurance companies. They have to make a business decision and go like, we can't. This shit that happened in LA is going to bankrupt a lot of these agencies. These insurance brokers are fucked because they can't pay out that.
Sure, they'll just get bailed out by the U.S. government. We know how this goes.
You know what? We can give it to Zelensky or we can give it to our own people.
Fair, I get it.
And there's other consequences where, especially in California, where if you end up destroying the hillsides with these fires, those mudslides and that stuff's going to get into the reservoirs, the drinking water. It's going to destroy it's going to bog up the systems. There's a lot that goes into that. And then you have what's called type conversions, right? Where you change a fuel model from a specific type of fuel, it burns out, and now invasive and not necessarily invasive species start to occupy that space. But if you have an area full of pine trees and it just nukes off, pine trees, they need fire to procreate and to spread their seeds. Like a sequoia specifically needs fire in order to get its pine cones to pop. And when those pine cones pop, it sends its seeds out. No fire means no new trees. But at the end of the day, there's Darwin at play here, where there is survival of the fittest happening on these hillsides, where if you have all these, tree saplings and that are trying to take, and they're getting choked out by noxious weeds and they can't compete for the sunlight and the water and the nutrients in the soil, you're just going to get a hillside full of grass. And we've already started to see that in California in a lot of different places where it type converts is what we call it. That fire was so hot, so intense, and so destructive that what should grow back in there is going to struggle a lot to grow back in there. And that's one of the reasons why there's a lot of programs with the Forest Service. There's a lot of really good NGOs, and sometimes Sierra Club even does this, where they go and they actually plant new seeds for the local areas after fires, which is honestly, I really admire those people that you see that are out there with a bag full of baby trees and they're just, putting trees out there. You got to do it. The consequences for that could be also too, you are going to make it where you can't live in certain parts of the state. There's a conversation that I have seen being done where people are saying like, hey, us as a society need to start saying, no, you can't put your house on this hillside because you're going to lose the house. You risk your own life. You risk the public, servant's life that are going there to try to save your house. Of course, we're also putting a lot more carbon in the air. You start messing with the ability to have aviation in certain spots. Like there's a lot that goes into like you not doing anything. It sucks, man. It's a really complex thing. Fire.
That's because like that's the issue. That's the problem that I'm trying to deal with here. Is this is maybe being a little too fine. I'll get to it. We catastrophize every sort of public conversation.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm going to go back to this argument on like the gun control situation. Is you have this moral imperative that's presented by the gun control activists that we have to quote unquote do something. And then the very thing that they do is only going to exacerbate the problem. And let me again, I'm trying to think of these different sort of ideologically sized problems that serve as the moral foundation for the existence of some. God, it sounds so pretentious. The moral foundations for the existence of a problem. Let me put it this way. Black Lives Matter. Violence is the language of the unheard. Marxism. These terms that James Lindsay will talk about, or Tim Pool, or if you turn on any news agency, it doesn't Fox, CNN, the New York Times. These are ideologically moral problems that are at the size of the ideology. If you don't listen to enough Black people, they're going to burn down your Wendy's. This kind of ridiculousness. And I know that sounds completely insane, but it's like, it's a caricature of what we're talking about. I'm intentionally using some hyperbole in that. And that's because when you read, let's take I'm trying to bring in different examples, but to illustrate what we're talking about here when it comes to fire. And what I oftentimes see is that you will see that there will be an example given about a certain concern. Let's use civil war as an example. There will be examples that are described, articulated, talked about frequently in the news, whether it's Tim Pool, whether it's Joe Rogan, whether it's CNN, Fox, Standard Media, or Legacy Media, that will be presented as if it's evidence for a certain worldview. And it's describing that something's going to happen, blank. Insert Alex Jones reference here. But what the what the person speaking will fail to do is that they will fail to present any sort of meaningful worldview from a whole worldview picture on what they're talking about. And this is where and so as a result, it creates the fuel, not to be too much of a pun, for essentially rampant conspiracy theories. And sometimes the answer is simple. Sometimes the answer is
usually pretty simple.
So I'll use the example of a recent tragedy, which was Matt Livelsberger. What we are being told is the scenario, what we understand to be what took place. And early on, because this happens January 1st, you have the Islamic attack, you have the terrorist attack, the ISIS attack that took place in New Orleans. So that's an incident. And then you have the VBID, the explosion of a vehicle outside of Trump Tower in Las Vegas, which is an event. And then there are these threads that could theoretically connect them. Like they both were at
You'd both probably eaten a hamburger before.
Exactly, right? These spurious connections. And then you have that they were both at they both were at the same base, same military base. What is it called? Fort Bragg, whatever they call it now, Fort Freedom, Fort Liberty. I don't give a hell, but it's called Fort Bragg. And then that to a person outside of the military is like, oh, they were in on it. They were both connected. And to those who are in the military know that Fort Bragg is a massive, massive fort that just because they both were at the same base at the same time has no meaningful connection. No meaningful connection at all. I was in Ranger Battalion in 3rd Battalion at the same time as Nick Irving. That doesn't mean that everything Nick Irving does is connected to everything that I do. Mm-hmm. We interacted with each other at battalion, but neither of us are going to remember that because it was like we probably stood in the chow hall at the same time. Okay? We were not deployed at the same time, or we were not deployed together. We didn't serve together in the fact that we didn't work together, but there are connections. So what that means and what I'm trying to do, I know I'm just making this so bloody confusing for everybody listening, is that Matt Livelsberger is the guy who is reported to be the person who died in the VBID, the vehicle explosion, the Cybertruck explosion outside Trump Tower in Las Vegas. Now, what immediately filled the world filled all public conversations were these different conspiracy theories about what happened. Was he connected to the New Orleans suicide bomber? What was he trying to say? What was he trying to do? Was this an attempt at Trump's life? Was there something bigger? And then as more and more information came out, it looks more and more and more and more like the man had a psychotic break.
Yes.
Wait, what does a psychotic break mean? Not to be Jordan Peterson on the subject, because I know he does this all the time, but what are you talking about? He started believing in things that were not real. He started having illusions. He started believing that illusions were real. Okay, you see where I'm going here?
Yeah.
So why I'm so frustrated about this subject, and what I wanted to bring you on the show to talk about was, and I hope I can hopefully close this rant off in a second, is that okay, when you're talking about a wildfire like what is going on in California, what is actually happening? Not what are all these little data points, but what is actually happening? And what are the myths that people believe in that are creating entire worldviews out of, right? There's no water in the pipes. Therefore, this was a directed energy attack against the United States for the intent of resettling the West with non-American migrants. Okay, fine. You can see how quickly this spirals into madness. What are we looking at, and what are the things that people are believing and making spurious connections to that are not real?
I mean, you know, if you think about it, conspiracies don't happen in a vacuum. There's usually a seed that's planted, and a lot of times it's planted in like reason. You know, with Lahaina, first of all, let me get rid of the easy one. The Jewish space lasers, or whoever owns space lasers, is fucking the stupidest thing I've ever fucking heard, and it makes me want to swan dive off a barn. I don't.
Well, you don't swan dive off a barn in where I live because they're not that tall, and you're just going to end up with a headache.
Yes, I'll have to crawl away. No, you know, our direct energy weapons real, yes, but like, dude, there's no like the insane amount of like electronic energy that would be required to punch through the Earth's atmosphere from space to like slick off a hillside is so comedically stupid. I don't even want to talk about it any further. Now I get where people in a cynical view look at what happened at Lahaina, what they're looking at what's happening in the Palisades right now, like, oh, you know, it's free land. That hasn't not happened in history before, right? Like I do understand that. With that said, though, you know, I don't want to not blame Gavin Newsom for anything that he isn't responsible for. Don't get me wrong, like that guy sucks a lot, and he's a dangerous politician. Karen Bass is just worthless. Gavin Newsom's dangerous.
Sure.
And as much as I want to blame him for everything, this isn't all his fault. It's certainly not Karen Bass's fault. Like she's not a clairvoyant. She had no idea that like the Santa, you know, she knew the Santa Anas were a possibility because she gets briefed on that, but she was in Ghana doing whatever you do in Ghana. And and she came home immediately, to her credit. She came home immediately. I've been watching her at press conferences. I know a lot of those guys standing next to her at those press conferences. I have no idea why Ted Lieu's in that crowd, but whatever. We talk about like there's no water in the pipes. So like let's get into that one real quick. Okay, so your house, right? My house is plumbed with water pipes, electrical lines, and so on and so forth. And I want people to think about electricity in the same way they think about water, right? You've got a downstem, and of course, if you cut an electrical line here, the electricity over there stops, right? Same with the water pipe. If I clamp a hose off, the hose water stops going that way.
Okay. Yeah. So I mean, I think most people who are listening to this show will know what you're talking about, and I don't want to like and I'm doing this for a reason. I don't want to make the assumption because things get missed when we make assumptions.
100%.
And so the water to my house, I can shut off all the water to my house by turning a lever. I can go over to a certain part of my house, turn a lever, which essentially shuts off all the water in my home. That means, and the water functions in my house because the water coming from the city is pressurized, which means it doesn't mean it's pressurized as in there's something pushing that water into my house that I can turn off.
Yep.
And I grew up on a well. I grew up on a well in rural Minnesota, and the thing that caused that water to come out of the ground was that there was a motor that was powered by electricity that pumped the water out of the ground.
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter whether you grow up on city water, where your dad yells at you for not letting the hose run because it costs money to let the hose run because the city charges you for the water that they pump into your house, or your dad yells at you when you're a kid for not letting the hose run in the backyard because he has to pay for the electricity to pump the water out of the ground. The water gets to your house because somebody is doing something.
Magical municipal ferries push it through the water pipes, don't you know?
Yeah, you know what I mean? Okay, so when the house that you live in, or the apartment that you are staying in, or the hotel that you are temporarily residing in, or the bridge under which your homelessness is experiencing, the water gets there somewhere. Okay, so where were you going with this? Why is there no water in the pipes?
So when you have a house burned down, and I went on a freaking rant yesterday on the internet on this very subject. When you have a house burned down, you are now compromising the integrity of the house. And I'm not talking about like a room and contents fire, like a Christmas tree burns in your blinds, burns your couch. I'm talking about the physical building burning down to its foundation. When you have that happen, you have exposed electrical lines, which can kill you. And then you also have exposed water lines. Now you can shut your water off at the main, and that will stop that house. But who's thinking about doing that when they're trying to get out, right? No one. Now, if you have one house doing that isn't typically an issue. When you start having an entire city block with wide open pipes, the pressure goes down. Imagine it's like considering like a death by 1,000 cuts, right? You have the
I was
body,
going to the exact analogy, right?
yeah, all these little bleeders are easy. I can go bonk and like the body will naturally shut it off. Now, if I have a bunch of little holes all around me, one, I'm going to lose the physical volume in which I am carrying with me because that's finite, just like municipal water sources are a finite amount of water.
Mm-hmm.
You also lose that pressure, right? And so when you have an entire city burned to its foundation, you have you have thousands of exposed water systems. That water is going to have to go somewhere until it can't. And so I saw some guys say something on the internet like, well, we can't see any water on the ground. Dude, go walk through the rubble of a burnt house and you'll be surprised how much of that ash is mud. And it's exactly mud from that reason. Also, it goes into the storm drain, dickhead, which also will start to clog those things up, and that causes a whole other issue.
Yeah, because I'm seeing an analogy go here. So the reason why there's no water in the pipes when people are is because the limb has been severed.
Yes,
and I like your analogy here. The death by 1,000 cuts here is that okay? When go get an IV. You know what I mean? Like have an IV done.
mm-hmm.
Somebody pokes a needle into a blood vein. That's not going to kill you by a loss of blood. Now, if you take, you get an IV done, you have an IV needle put into your vein of your arm, and the water is pumping, or the blood is leaking, and you don't close it off. You don't put your finger over it. Mm-hmm. You're gonna lose enough blood eventually, potentially, to have issues where the body will start shutting down. But if you sever a limb, whether through an explosion or through a sword fight, you're going to bleed out because the amount of blood that is leaving your body is so grand that your circulatory system will not be able to function. So you're saying it's the same model, is that when a city experiences a fire that causes this much damage, there is not enough. It creates a vacuum that pulls the water, a pressure vacuum that pulls all the water out of the system, or the pressure doesn't function. Am I making any sense at all?
Yeah, I mean, I'll continue to use the analogy of the human body. So we talk about the pipes themselves being compromised, right? If I got a bunch of IV catheters in my arm and they're just bleeding, I'm going to eventually die. But you also have to consider that the heart has stopped in this instance, where you have the municipal power supply that's been severed through power lines. It's burning junction boxes that people don't realize when they're walking around their city. What are these little things, these random buildings that kind of out in these boxes? Those are sometimes your water pumps, those are sometimes your generators, etc. Right? Mm-hmm. When they burn and the pump stops getting electricity, it can't pump anymore. Right? So it's the same analogy of the heart. Like in this instance, you have both IV catheters in my body and my heart stopped. So, and people also need to understand that there are some fail states built into these municipal systems, hopefully, where not one water pipe feeds every possible fire hydrant, right? You've got water districts, so to speak. If you were to go to Montebello right now, which is in East Los Angeles, I guarantee you one of those fire hydrants is going to have water in it. If you go to Burbank, I guarantee you they've got water in their fire hydrants right now. But everything that's out in those areas that are compromised, you've compromised the water supply. So when they're saying they're running out of water, they're not wrong, because like each fire apparatus is only capable of carrying anywhere between about 500 gallons of water. Water tenders can carry anywhere from like 15 to 3,000 gallons, depends on the model. And once they're out of water, they're out of water, dude. Until someone
so fire app. Sorry, I need to make sure we don't get stuck in a fire truck. Okay.
Yeah. Fire trucks.
So the city that is the part of this. So this, going back to the complexity of the fire, when something that you described as a complexity, one element of that makes it complex is that you have wood, you have like the forest is on fire, not to make a weird analogy, but you also have the city. So a park, a natural park, is going to burn different than an urban environment, a conflagration.
So you got to consider what's inside of our buildings nowadays too is a lot less normal organic matter. Like our clothes aren't made of wood or made of wool; they're made out of plastic. Our couches are made out of plastic. Everything in our house is made out of some sort of organophosphates.
So
And,
Timu is the reason. We get to blame Timu now.
Yeah, all our microplastics are killing us. But no, so like fighting fire on a, if I have a piece of dirt that's on fire, if I put wet stuff on the red stuff, it tends to go out. House fires are going to be more inherently resistant to fire suppression efforts because of what's inside of them. And now if you have, and they put out an incredible amount of BTUs, which stands for British thermal units. Like that's a measurement of heat. It's not just the direct flame impingement that causes fires to spread. The radiant heat that comes off of these fires, it starts to preheat these unburned areas. They make them ready to burn, and then as soon as it gets to the right temperature, it lights off. They could have had all the water in the world, and I don't think they would have had a result that is too dissimilar to what we have right now. And that's something I don't think anyone wants to acknowledge. I get why the internet and the news are over everything Gavin Newsom does and doesn't do, and Karen Bass is at fault and all this. I get it, right? There's a natural need to have an explanation for complicated situations. No one wants to sit there and be like, "Oh, sorry, you can't go to the mall today with the car, kid. It's a little bit more complicated than that." The kid wants to know, why can't I go? And then you also have, just like with the lizard brain shit taking over with everybody on the internet, like people want the dopamine hits. They want to just sit there and rage. And then you have the media outlets that are at fault for just sensationalizing everything on earth for ratings and dopamine and all that other shit.
Yep.
But the truth is, like, they could have had all the water in the world and it wouldn't have made that much of a difference. When that wind is doing what it's going to do, bro, there's almost nothing you can do. The Sayre fire didn't have the issue with all the water getting shut off because of the compromised infrastructure. That fire still went and nuked off and did what it did anyway. Yeah. The Thomas fire in 2017 in Ventura County, that was a wind-driven Santa Ana fire. It was blown offshore and it just let it burn to the ocean. Is some of the suppression tactics that you have to do sometimes in these areas.
Yep.
I don't mean to say this in a callous way. At the end of the day, they're just bushes and buildings. They can be replaced so people can't. And I want to say something too on this topic, specifically about like the way I've seen people on the right doing this quite a bit and the left to a lesser degree is oh, I don't feel bad for all these celebrities that lost their homes. Dude, you're a piece of shit. That's a person. That's their homes. That's their livelihood, their memories. They don't have like piles of cash sitting over there that they can just go rebuild. Like, people don't understand how wealth works in a lot of these situations and where people hold wealth and how that transpires. The fact that those people lost their homes is a fucking tragedy, man. Like, I feel bad for Paris Hilton. I feel bad for James Woods. Like, I've never had my house burned to the ground, and I don't care how much resources are available to me. That is a traumatic event.
Yeah.
So
okay.
I've gotten that out of the way.
All right. So I think I know how I want to structure the rest of this conversation now. I know it's taken us an hour and 20 minutes to build into where, you know what I mean? Like, this is, but don't get me wrong, because I think what's going to take, we have about 40 minutes left of this conversation maximum right now. Sure. And I think I know how I want to structure it. And I'm going to be very, I'm going to describe that in the show to break the fourth wall so that the audience knows what I'm thinking and how I think we can get there. So, one, talking about feeling bad about people, and this is going to be a moral argument. Two, and then I want to make a statement, perhaps a little bit authoritarian in like as an authority on the subject about feeling about people. And then I want to ask you to do something. So, one, feeling bad about people is a very weird thing that we do so often in contemporary, in our day and age. And if we were to step out of the world that we live in, the United States, the West, in 2020, if we were to step out of that, whether it's physically go to a different country with a different worldview or to a different time, I think we would look at ourselves as sort of a ridiculous people. And I'm going to use the example of starving children in Africa. And I'm not the only person who's made this argument, but it's when you turn on your television and there's a commercial for some charity about starving children in Africa, when you go to your church on Sunday and they want you to donate money to starving children in Africa, you as an individual, A, have no idea whether that person even exists, B, will make no meaningful impact on their life whatsoever, and C, if you do, it's morally reprehensible that a person should be compelled to care about things that they have no influence over whatsoever. Because one, you have no idea whether that child even exists. It's not whether it's created by AI, whether it's a photo that was taken 70 years ago, 30 years ago. You get my point? You see what we're going with? There's this, like, so there's a difference between putting energy into something, caring about something, not caring, zero, and putting energy into something that is negative. Does that make sense? So I'm going to use a reference to food that I get teased on every once in a while, but I make sense. I'm going to use 3 foods. I don't like avocados. I like steak. Okay, these are not crazy ideas. So I have a preference for steak. When it comes to avocados on a burger, I could care whether they're on or not. I don't care. I don't like it. I don't not like it. But it's tomatoes, fresh tomatoes. I actively do not like fresh tomatoes. So if I'm eating a salad, I'm going to not eat the tomatoes because I don't like what they taste like. If I have avocado in my salad, I will not go out of my way. But croutons, I like croutons, so I will make sure that I eat all the croutons in my salad. Does this make sense?
I'm pretty sure I'm tracking. I mean, you're talking about like morality has an aesthetic. Like if I kill a spider, I'm a hero, but if I kill a butterfly, I'm a monster.
I'm talking about caring about people. So, for example, I do not care about starving children in Africa because whether or not I make an emotional decision about starving children in Africa is not going to change anything for them or for me. It's just going to virtue signal. I'm just going to be expressing some sort of emotion and idea about something. I'm going to be I'm talking literally about virtue signaling here, and how. So when so in a reference to this with the fire, I can when I hear a story about somebody losing their house, I can feel bad. What does that do? Not really sure. Maybe it actually does something though. It illustrates the orientation of my heart. I can not feel anything. You know what? It's not really significant to me. If I hear about a house fire in Barcelona, it doesn't mean anything to me. But if I hear about a fire in, say, Notre Dame in France, that does mean something to me because 1, I've been there, 2, it has religious significance, and 3, it's a very beautiful building. But when I hear about somebody having a house fire in California, and I choose to deliberately have the emotion of ha ha ha, mockery, that is what I think is an issue, is that you're reveling in somebody else's suffering. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, so not only does the Old Testament and the New Testament warn against this, but there's something morally reprehensible about celebrating over somebody else's misfortune. And you see this happen, or let's see, making political hay off of it. And this is the warning I think that we're coming to. You see it in government. You see this in right now. You see this in right-wing media, kind of going ha ha ha. Look at what those silly Californians are dealing with, and it's like, okay, it's not only is it crass, it's stupid. But you also see this happen like anytime. What is it? There's a shooting at a Christian school. There will be the ghouls that come out from the left that say, "What about your thoughts and prayers now?" And it's like, yep, you're a morally reprehensible person, and I am no longer required to consider you an arbiter of that what is right and true and good. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Am I being very clear? I'm not. I know I'm not being very clear on this, but I'm talking about this idea that we are trying to convince one another whether or not we should or should not care or feel a certain way about something, not whether or not we should fix the issue. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think I'm tracking you.
Yeah. So there's an odd thing that goes, and I think this is germane to our time in the timeline of the world that we live in, is that the vast majority of our efforts in politics, in culture, in society are spent with the effort to make people say certain things. And I think this is because this is caused by the void of religion in our society. So it's not that there isn't religion, it's that we're just creating activism to fit the role of religion. And what I mean by that is, in a society that is centered on a set of morals, we would we have a collective foundation upon which to make decisions, but we don't have that in a multicultural society. So instead, we have to create pseudo religions, which comes in the form of activism in order to fill that gap. And then that gap is what we spend all of our time essentially proselytizing on. Now, as a result, gosh, I've made this way more complicated. As a result, we, you know what I mean? As a result, we spend so much of our time, effort, and energy convincing each other to believe a certain thing or think a certain way instead of doing anything. So when it comes to the wildland fires, last example is when it comes to our last example is the election of Donald Trump. There's somebody that the second in 2024, a friend of mine made a comment that I thought was quite profound, but it also started to resonate across the conversations about politics going forward. And that is, Donald Trump, the election of Donald Trump gave off, quote, big dad energy. And what I mean by that is, instead of complaining and going through and making all these emotional decisions about how people feel and think and whatever, instead of trying to figure out, and we'll use an example in American politics on blah, 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 blah. Instead, what the energy of the room that was being demonstrated of the election of Donald Trump was that, okay, we're not playing this stupid game anymore. We're going to fix a legitimate problem. And it doesn't, and this is how we're going to do it. And we're going to lay out the solution, and then we're going to move forward going on. And what I mean by that, and what I would like you to do is, for the next 30 minutes, you know what I mean, is do the big dad energy on, instead of talking about how we should think about, and this is not, I'm not accusing you of doing this, but with all the moralizing going on about, oh, it's this guy's fault, or these people deserve it, or whatever, what were the things that, if we could have done or California could have done, that would have mitigated this fire in the past? What is the AAR? What went wrong? What could have been done that should have been done? Not like, well, we should have built our houses out of a non-flammable material, or we should have, like, what are things that California could have done, including Bass, Newsom, the city, the individuals who are involved in firefighting? What could they have done? And then what do you recommend people that California does going forward? Does that make sense? Have I kind of gone this full circle on how we spend all this time talking about how we should feel about something, and I don't care. I don't care anymore about illiterate morons expressing how we should feel about a certain thing. Okay? I don't care about that. Stop telling me how I should think about lesbian black people, and fix the damn problem.
Yeah, I think I know where you're going with this. To talk about the morality of the response to tragedies real quick. There's a difference between empathy and sympathy for somebody, right? And then,
for sure.
And both of those have a point of diminishing return, so they become self-destructive to the individual that's expressing the emotions. Now, I don't think you need to go out of your way to, like, lament poor Paris Hilton. Like, these people will be okay. But at the same time, if you don't have any humanity in you, and like you said, you just ha at these people when shit goes down like that, it's a very gross way to live. And I see a lot of Christians that act this way whenever anything happens to, like, a blue state, and you're like, dude, what did Jesus say? Like, love thy neighbor, right? this is not an example of you doing that. Now, again, of course, you don't have to self-flagellate yourself for other people constantly.
Yeah.
To talk about like the big daddy energy, or like to be the adult in the room with all this stuff, it's, again, I hate to say this, it's going to be a little bit difficult to answer that. There's what the homeowner is responsible for when it comes to responding to tragedies like this, or to preemptively to respond to that. California does have laws on the books that say you have to have defensible space around your house. It is not often enforced in some areas, because the second these municipalities start to enforce these laws, it makes the homeowners pissed off, and then they're going to get rid of you off city council and blah, 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 pay your taxes and all this other shit. Like, on one hand, we want the government to do something. On the other hand, we don't want the government to have any say in what I'm doing here. Like, dude, all right, then good luck. You know, if you want to build your house at the top of a drainage and not remove any of the brush and just have like, it might as well just be in the middle of the forest at that point. Then I'm not going to risk a lot to save nothing. And as a first responder, and fire departments have a checklist of basically how to triage houses before they go and they try to stand their ground in the face of a frontal assault and a fire, which is a very dangerous thing to do. You're putting unburned fuel between you and the fire that allows the fire to gain a lot of momentum and hit these people really, really hard. The big daddy thing for me would just tell everybody that doesn't want to get involved is sit down and shut up. We're doing this. Like, I would, not to sit there and be a jackboot fucking statist, but hey man, sucks to suck. We're going to go in there and we're going to do some prescribed fires. Sucks to suck. We're going to go in there and find the shit out of you for having a propane tank surrounded by brush, for welding in a windstorm, like all these things that, like, the common sense. Like, I'm not a big fan of the government like finding people over shit. Don't get me wrong, before everybody reads in the comments. But do you want a society or not? Right?
Yes. Okay.
This isn't an anarchy situation here, and this isn't a communist dictatorship. There's a balance, which we seem to have always found. We need to get our act together. We need to take these things seriously. And we also, I think, need to, and this is the hardest one for everybody, understand that life is full of fucking uncertainty and chance.
Yes.
And randomness. People are like, why did this house burn and not that house burn? Ugh, like, bro, I've never been able to tell you the answer to that. I've been on a lot of fires that you see. It's not even just with like houses. You see it with certain like plants. Like, how come that plant didn't burn and everything around it's like the surface of the moon? It just didn't. Right. Like, of course, there's probably some factor there that can be like split into atoms and discovered. But no, I mean, the world is cruel. The world is random. And you don't need to add any more into it than necessary. Right.
Sure. So going back to so two things that you suggested right now are, I'm sorry, as you continue, assume that the activists are no longer in the room. Just assume that, you know what I mean? Like, I'm no longer, there are certain people that I'm no longer interested in convincing one way or another. Go your own way. Sorry, I can't help you. You know what I mean? And so like, and this is called triage. When it comes to when there's a mass casualty situation, you do triage. You're a medic, you know what I mean? You're going to tell me that I'm using the word wrong. Say what?
The word triage is French. It means to sort. Hi.
Yeah. Okay. So you're going to sort out priorities. And the same thing goes with people in conversations. There are some people who are so stuck in their ways that you cannot convince them. So be it. Go your own way. Good luck on that cliff. I'm not going to, whatever. I am no longer compelled to have any sort of empathy or sympathy towards the outcome of your actions because you've chosen this path for yourself. So, okay, there's that. Assume those people are outside of the room. Now, the issue that we're dealing with. Okay, you live in California. That means look at your property and make sure you have this space that you need, right? Mm-hmm. So for the homeowner, the individual, that is, do your due diligence, trim your damn trees. I'm guessing. What else? But then, build it from the individual and scale it up as you go. So what would you suggest for the individual, the city, the state, and then for us as a community?
Well, unfortunately, asking any government in California to undertake a task is usually going to end up in disaster. As we've seen, we've spent $20 billion on homelessness, and God help you if you can tell me where that's done for anybody.
I mean, we know what it did. It made a couple of very corrupt people very rich. That's it. You know what I mean? Like, okay, fine. So no, and again, I'm going to go back to the big dad energy. Okay, who did it? Find the ever-loving hell out of them, throw them in a box, tell them that they're no longer allowed to operate a corporation, and be done with it. You know what I mean? Like, that's the issue that I know that's a hyperbole, but my point is, when there's something like let's talk about the train derailment in Ohio 2 years ago. I think it was 2 years ago, right? Right. So there was somebody who failed, who either was negligent in their job or was deliberate in sabotage. Okay. Either or, who did what? Or was it a bona fide accident? Hey, we didn't know that, we didn't know that the tracks were going to buckle because of the heat of the city doing the thing at the time with the cold. I don't know, right? You get my point.
Yeah.
But the point is there culpability? Yes, then prosecute. If somebody used the $17 million that went into homelessness to enrich their own lives, cool. You don't have that money anymore. That car is no longer your vehicle. That business is no longer an operation. You can this can be done. We've become so passive as a society that we think, oh, corruption's just going to be corrupt. Like, okay, we don't have to abide by this anymore.
Well, we've tried to do. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
So what I'm trying to say is, again, cut that out and assume that, okay, where would you want the money to go? What would you want government funding and government programs to act? What would a properly running government program look like in this case?
So the properly run government program is going to require them to put money into, again, like the California Conservation Corps, open up the private sector to allow businesses to get grants and to create businesses and jobs for people to go out there and do this field mitigation. It's something that I would love to have always done on my own, is start a business that's going out there and just, hey man, we're turning shit into coleslaw all winter. We're making, we're going to do our part.
Essentially brush removal. Hey,
yeah,
that's too much. There's too much brush building up in this area. Too much plants.
When I say like prescribed fire work, fuel management, treatment of these zones, it's basically what we're talking about is removing the brush, right? Holding people accountable becomes a little difficult because it's in the instance of like an arson, right? That idiot caused this. We got him. But then people aren't always gonna be satiated with that. They're like, well, how come the water pipes still weren't working? Like, and there's no one to blame for these things that are like actual dominoes falling over. In 2018, in November, there was the camp fire in Paradise, California. It killed 85 people in like a very, very, very short couple minutes. Again, perfect storm, winds, got in perfect alignment with the topography, and the one way in, one way out nature of that community was just a disaster waiting to happen. That was found to be at fault of, I think, PG&E. So Pacific Gas and Electric, they didn't turn off the power lines when they knew they needed to. And it took a lot of fighting, but the people ended up suing the shit out of PG&E. And PG&E decided to help take out the cost on the customer. Gavin Newsom, who has ties to PG&E, allowed that to happen. So PG&E was allowed to raise their rates, and all these other places are raising their rates to cover the cost of the lawsuits that they are responsible for. So you got to stop letting people do that. If you are going to end up causing this, you are going to no longer be a business. There's also the issues of the power vacuums that exist when you take away like major utility companies. Taking the money and putting it into actual programs that are physically putting people in the public lands to do the fuel reduction is the only way. And again, we're talking years of this. We're talking billions upon billions of dollars are going to be required to do this in the long-term game of it. We need to stop allowing the activists in the room to have a say. We need to allow, some of these corporations to go in there and start to cut trees. But don't get me wrong, the activists do have a good role in this because it does prevent these businesses from just being pieces of shit and slicking off hillsides and not doing any like actual stewardship of the land. You know, it's there used to be a sexy thing that existed in our culture back in like the turn of the 19th or 18th to 20th century. Sorry, 19th to 20th century, where public land management, land use, stewardship of the land, that was thought to be of a high caliber calling. You know, when you ask the average guy that works for the Forest Service why they do it, it damn sure isn't because they get paid well. A lot of the guys that stick with it, which not everybody sticks with the Forest Service, many of those guys end up leaving for like LA County Fire, which makes LA County Fire Department a very good fire department when it comes to fighting wildland fire, because most of those boys have done quite a bit of it before they get there. LA City definitely has former hotshots that work there, but nothing in the numbers that like county seems to do. Kern County Fire Department is full of a lot of guys that used to do time in wildland, but you make it where these people go like, dude, why would I get my ass kicked on a fire for 2 weeks, working 14 hours a day to make $6,000 versus this county guy who never leaves his air-conditioned Suburban as a line medic and makes $20,000+ for the same 2 weeks? I'm going to go do his job. You know, you have to give the incentive to stay in the Forest Service. We need to stop. There's been a conversation that has been going on in California for some time about not laying off the seasonal firefighters anymore. They're called 1039s. It's a designation. They're only allowed to work like 1,039 hours, something like that. I might be wrong. But when you lose half of your workforce over a pay period because they get laid off because they're supposed to, now you don't have the physical bodies to go fight these fires either. You know, your hotshot crew is 20 men, and at least half of that is seasonal, right? You have a superintendent, 2 captains, 2 squad bosses, and usually about 4 senior or lead firefighters, and everybody after that is a seasonal. The engine modules, you have a captain, an engineer, an AFEO, which stands for assistant fire engine operator, and 1 or 2 senior firefighters, and then 2 to 4 seasonals, right? You have to mothball these fire stations in the wintertime. You have to close down this fire station over here and consolidate those guys into these fire stations, which are generally well decided ahead of time, which are the most busiest ones that require the most coverage. You're not going to take a fire station off the I-5, which is one of the busiest Forest Service stations in the entire country, and mothball that and keep up Chileo, which means nothing to you. Chileo is just a location on the Angeles National Forest, which is high up in the high mountains that gets a lot of snow, and there's not going to be a lot of fires during that time. So like removing the worker bees is not helpful. Again, we need to allow private industry as well as government funded initiatives to go in physically, like I said, remove the brush. Rakes, shovels, chainsaws, goats, and timber and fire. Reintroducing fire back into the ecosystem is a lot more difficult than people want it to be, unfortunately. Because again, if this happened in January, these fires are going on in January right now. This is the winter. Now you'll have a very limited window when you can put fire on the ground for prescribed fire operations. And the second that fire jumps out of containment, now it's a suppression effort. And you are no longer doing any more of the prescribed fire. You're shutting the whole operation down.
So what is it when you hear people say containment? What does that mean?
Actually, it's a really good question. I really like this question a lot, actually, because I see this on the internet quite a bit. And it's not that people are freaking out. They just don't understand. The news will sit there and say, oh, the fire is 0% contained or 15% contained or whatever. Containment percentages don't just happen the second you put a bulldozer in between the green and the black, right? That line needs to hold for at least 24 hours before they'll give that a designated, it's contained. And even then, it's not bomb proof, right? That's when you start having people in the back side of the fire operation start doing what's called mop up. And they're basically taking, some of the existing fire hose and they're just putting some more wet stuff in the black, meaning the area that's already burned. That's still got a lot of heat on it. Let me put that down, because if the wind picks that up and blows those embers across your containment lines, now you have either a slop over or a spot fire. Slop over is basically where the fire kind of just blech, and it connects back to the green and it starts burning again. A spot fire is typically going to be something that's caused by an ember being picked up and casted ahead of the fire itself or outside the containment lines and creates its own new fire. Sometimes those spot fires can be over 1.5 miles away from the main body of the fire, depending on how much convective heat is bringing that completely burned material into the atmosphere. And then, of course, the winds that carry it forward, and then it lands in a receptive fuel bed.
Yep.
So containment numbers, containment percentages don't just happen. Like I said, the second they put a line around the fire, it needs to hold for a specific amount of time. and then ultimately it's up to the decision of the incident command team when they start to designate how much of that's contained. Now, contained and controlled are different things. You can have a fire that's 100% contained, right? Like, I mean, if you have a fire that burns in the middle of a freeway and the grass median, I mean, technically that's 50% contained, right? But it's not under control because it can still move and do its thing, still cause damage. Controlling is usually something that takes its designation much longer down in the operations, because you have firefighting efforts that have to happen, right? So we're trying to suppress the fire, and then there's rehabilitation efforts. So in 2015, I spent 41 days on the Rough Fire, which burned on the south part of the Sierra National Forest and the north part of the Sequoia National Forest, the Kings River, Lake Hume. When I got there, the fire was 35 acres. By the time I went home, it was 165,000. Some of that is because we couldn't physically get in and fight fires. You can't always fight fire in some of these places. You mean when the mountain's like this and it's made out of shale, we joke and we say it's billy goat country. You can't get in there. And so the joke is to also just wash it off the hill, send helicopters and just wash it off the hill, throw money at it. When you look at the cost of fire suppression efforts, like when you see the millions of dollars it takes to put out a fire, a significant percentage of that is aerial assets alone. And so sometimes you can't fight fire. Sometimes it just has to do its thing. So when I was on that fire for 41 days, I would come home every 2 weeks for about 2 days, and I go back for 2 more weeks. The last 2-week stint that I did out there was for the rehab process. And I took out a crew from Porterville, California, a bunch of what we call call-when-neededs. They're not full-time firemen. They basically have normal jobs. And in this instance, a lot of these guys are migrant field workers. And they end up coming out with us with a permanent Forest Service staff, crew bosses and assistant crew bosses. And we go out there and we're pulling fire hose off the fire line. We're seeing big open bulldozer, bulldoze blade paths will kind of drag brush over that, and kind of depending on like the needs of that area, we might end up putting in like rain diversion culverts. I can't remember the name of them. Those just big straw tubes, or those tubes full of straw. You end up putting those into places so as the rains, which eventually come, they don't just wash everything off, because that's also a danger into the recovery of that land too. If you end up, ash is really, really, really good for growing crops, and so it's good and conducive. A lot of the nitrogen cycle stuff takes place there. There's bacteria that gets reintroduced into the soils, which I want to talk about the bacteria thing as it relates to salt water. Everyone keeps talking about why won't we use salt water to fight fires.
I get. Do you need to, or is it? Have you really?
Very fast. There was a guy that had a really interesting thread on Twitter. I wish I could remember his name right now. He broke it down very succinctly. It damages the infrastructure. You're going to have to use bronze for a lot of the pumps, a lot of the couplings, a lot of the hose nozzles. You can't always keep the lines charged because it's going to degrade those systems. And also, yes, you can use seawater in small increments to fight fire and little stuff. They're doing it right now. Those Quebecs, the super scoopers that come from Canada this time of year, they're dipping into the Pacific and they're dumping it. There's problems with that though, because now you're reintroducing bacteria into the soil that isn't native to that part of the soil. It's seaborne bacteria, and you can cause significant delays in like the vegetation growing back. And so yeah, fighting fire is all cool and fun stuff, but this is where the Forest Service does need its flower counters to go out there and understand what's actually happening ecologically.
Yeah, because I mean, have you never heard the phrase "salt the earth"?
Yes,
what I mean. It's just kind of like, well, you're gonna put the fire out, yes, but you're also gonna make it so that you will destroy the land in the process.
If you do it too much, for sure. I mean, like a little bit of seawater here and there is not going to be the end.
It's a Pyrrhic victory. So
yeah, exactly. That's a perfect way of saying it. Like we put a fire out, but then look what we did after that.
Yeah.
And that's been kind of like, if you think about it, all the fire suppression efforts in the West of the last 100 years have been Pyrrhic victories, because, we put the fire out really fast. Okay, now we have these big fires we can't control. Mm-hmm. This is what winning looks like.
Yep. So the adage is true that we've chosen short-term gains for long-term losses, and it's time to correct that ship. And the best.
Yeah, and a lot of people want to blame incompetence on that, and I don't blame people for thinking that these things are matters of incompetence over malice. I think there's a problem with people with a lack of imagination and creativity for problem solving too. Can we manage our lands in the ways that organizations like the Sierra Club wants to do? Yeah, of course we can. Can we manage lands in the ways that the timber industry wants to do and benefit from? Yes, we can. Everybody can get what they need out of this, but at the same time, people can't get everything that they want. Again, that Big Daddy answer, at some point, someone needs to just shut up and sit down. The adults are working right now.
Yeah, well, it's a problem that it's a problem that we need to fix. There are ways to do it, and if you're deliberately standing in the way of that, then you need to be removed. So
I think people, again, if we want to make a difference in the West, if we want to make some change out here, we do need to pressure the politicians. Hey, you guys need to be having this conversation about land management much more than we already are. And there's a part of me that is seeing that conversation happening on right now. There's a lot of people eating black and red pills in LA that are like, what the fuck? But at the same time, there's just going to be chance involved in this. And we can't nerf the corners of the world so much that it's become completely safe. There's going to be fires. We're always going to have fires. The water mains not having water, that is the rage behind that simply just comes from people not understanding what physically transpires when a building burns to the ground. This is what it is, man. Like, I don't know what to tell you. Like, you can breathe, houses are a different animal. You can breathe to obviously a diminishing level. You can breathe smoke coming from a wildland fire. It's not typically overly toxic. You take one breath of some of the stuff that's being burned off in a house or a car, you will fucking die or turn into a fucking eggplant the rest of your life because your brain's zapped, because some of the byproducts of some of these materials in our homes is cyanide when they burn. So we had an incident in California where there was a person from out of state. She wasn't from out of state. She was definitely off forest, where they were fighting fire in this one canyon on the Angeles. And there's some old mining tailings that are lying around. And the fire had gotten into the mining tailings and started burning some of that shit up. And this gal walked through it, and she to this day is a vegetable. Fire in the world is just really, it's brutal, man.
Yep.
Like, I wish it was simple. I wish it was. I mean, I want to be mad at somebody too. I get it, dude. But there's so much that's going into this stuff. And I really hope, if people watch this that are on the job right now, I hope I am doing your job a service still by expressing some of the frustrations that I know we have. I hope I didn't gloss over stuff. I know there's things that I don't even consider that are good that go into this, because I was just a GS5, dude. I was not, a battalion chief. I was not a captain. This is a difficult conversation to have. My fear with all of this is, and I'll hang it up here. My fear with all of this is that we have the attention span of a goldfish, and we're going to stop thinking about this and caring about it not very long down the line. Because Donald Trump's going to take over in 10 days, and those people are going to be reading about something else.
Yeah. Well, I do think that is going back to if we were able to step out of our time in the timeline, I think we would look at our era as an extremely foolish people who are more interested in being entertained by the tragedy than solving the problem.
Sure.
And I think
that's the way of putting it, actually. Entertained by the tragedy instead of solving it.
And I hope that like I see this in my own life, which is true. I see the tragedy. I see it where I'm more interested in being caught up in the emotion and the tragedy of the situation than I am about thinking about a solution. And I hope that from hearing this, we're able to course correct, because
sure,
it's not good enough to have your rage bait. So
I hate to say this, but I guess if there's anybody that we want to have this shit happen to that might spark change, it's these people that it happened to in the Palisades. If Palmdale or Lancaster, California slicks off, most people aren't going to give a shit because they're not from Palmdale, and Palmdale and Lancaster aren't the rich, opulent neighborhoods. When the Palisades go up, those people who are pissed off about other things like the Donald Trump and all the other politicians are doing, they're going to be pissed off about this now. And there's a hopeful chance that maybe some change will actually come from this. But I ask and encourage people, if you're a young man and you're in high school right now, or if you're in the military trying to figure out what you're going to do when you get out, join the U.S. Forest Service. Join U.S. Forest Service. Go to BLM. Go to the Bureau of Land Management. Go to the National Park Service. work for some of these fire agencies. Hell, there's private fire departments that exist out there right now in the wildland scene that have gotten better than they used to be. But dude, get out there and do the work. Give a damn about this stuff, you know?
Yeah.
And I mean, I get people feel like they're pissing in the wind, and in some ways they are, but we need to make apathy not cool again.
Yeah, well, the black pill is rather the black pill of cynicism is not conducive to healthy societies.
I'm trying to create a new meme. I'm calling it the green pill, and the green pill is it's kind of a mix of what happens after you take the white pill, right? Like the black pill is like, oh fuck, everything's fucked and pointless, and the white pill is like things are fucked, but okay. The green pill, I look at it is like you see these things for opportunity, right?
Yeah.
You know, I want this to be looked at as a seed being planted. You take the green pill, you're planting seeds, man. You see the tragedy, you see the problems because you've taken the red and the black pill. You're aware of them now. This is the antithesis of like the black pill because this is not the defeatist thing. This is like, all right, look, man, we have opportunities that can come and grow from this.
Yeah.
So I'm that default 2nd Ranger Battalion medic. You can't be in 275 if you talk about the rain all day, bro. It's going to drive you crazy. Stop talking about the fucking rain. It's going to stop raining if you stop talking about it. We know it's raining. I'm in it too. You know what I mean? So just shut up and do your job.
Yeah.
You know, I don't know.
Well, let's end on that note. You know, I think let's end on that note, and hopefully hopefully I'll be able to see you in a couple days. But
man, I'm looking forward to it. This is our 3rd podcast together. I'm humbled every time we do this. I have no idea why anybody wants to hear me speak.
I know why I want to hear you speak. And so
I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to kind of stamp down some of this stuff, kind of explain it. I wish Sean Ryan, if you're watching this, you know, I would love to like continue this conversation with anyone that wants to have it. We need to stop driving ourselves crazy.
This is something that I agree with. I appreciate your take on it. And as much as we could get like, you know, get our temporary fame points for saying stop being stupid or whatever. It's also like, what's the point, you know? And I'm okay with. I'm encouraged by what you have to say in the sense that we can either continue to entertain ourselves by getting mad about this, or we can just fix the damn problem. And it's going to take a long time. And you know what the good thing is about that? That's a lot of jobs. And I know a lot of people who are looking for good jobs. So, hey.
We're going to be, you know, some of our mutual friends, me and Phil Levante and Amy, we are working on hopefully moving the needle in DC and getting some change in front of the incoming administration that maybe we can put some of our men to work in doing work like this.
Yeah, maybe the cure to male loneliness is having a decent job.
The cure for male loneliness is being on a hotshot crew, drinking, you know, freaking coffee and chewing up Copenhagen and sleeping in the woods, dude.
Well, I mean, hey, maybe it seems like a lot of our life has felt like you can either have a job that's going to be fulfilling, or you can have a job that pays the bills, and you can't, and it'll never.
I don't have either one of those right now, so yeah.
Well, neither do I guess. Yeah. So we'll figure it out. But hey, Tim, thanks for coming on. Where do people find you? How do they follow your stuff?
You can find me on Instagram at Revere275, Revere like Paul Revere, or Instagram or Twitter at HSolo275, or just Ralph the Airborne Ranger.
Ralph the Airborne Ranger. All right, Tim, thank you so much for coming on the show, for bearing with my terrible antics and attempting to not over rant myself. Thank you very much for kind of pulling back the veil on how these fires work, and thank you for all the information that you provided. I look forward to seeing you, and I look forward to having more conversations with you, even on different subjects. But for those who are listening, you know, leave comments below. We've been growing steadily, but if you want to support the show, you can head over to redactedllc.com. That's just going to be the hub of information when we have merch and stuff for sale, products I've worked on. Then you'll find it there. Or you can head over to redactedculture.locals.com. And that's where you can just straight out support the show, and the money that you put into that also does help going towards our public land cleanups. So we're trying to get a bunch more in this year. If you have nothing else to comment on, leave a comment below on somewhere that you know needs a public land cleanup for areas where we like to go shoot in the wilderness, so we can keep them clear. That being the case, we will talk to you later. Now go forth and conquer.
Adios.